started. Lord, thank you for today and for this class. I pray that you will bless this class, help us to grow and to receive from you. I pray for any of those that are traveling out in the rain that you'd help them to get here, help Jamie to get here, Lord. And we thank you for everything you're doing in our lives, Lord. I pray this class will be fruitful for us. In Jesus' name, amen. All right. So in a second, we'll pick back up where we left off last week, which is talking about why we may not have many archaeological discoveries in the land of Israel. But I thought I'd give you two kind of quick thoughts. One is related to the Exodus. And the Bible says that when God found Moses, when Moses saw the burning bush, he was in the land of Midian. Did anybody get a chance to watch that movie? Anybody? You good? Okay. So it's good. If you get a chance to see it this week, you had seen it before. Yeah, because I thought you, because I asked if you'd had, I thought I'd given you one already. But yes, it's good to watch it again. It's still in the same place. The mountain is. Yeah, it's good. It's a good refresher. Yeah. So Midian is where he goes, right? And so just kind of interesting about why Midian. So he's over here in Egypt, right? And so here's the thought: why leave when he left? I mean, he could have gone anywhere in the world. Do you think it was just random that he went to Midian? Because this wasn't, as far as we know, any kind of command of the Lord, right? Once God found him in Midian, God gave him a command to go back. But when he leaves Egypt, all we're told is that he's fleeing for his life, basically, right? And so he's leaving Egypt. He's wandering over into this region in Midian. So any thoughts about why? I mean, he knew the land. Josephus tells us that Moses was a general in Pharaoh's army, and that he had several. Josephus was a priest during the time of right after Christ. In the line of the high priest, actually. He was a general in Israel's army and a relative of the high priest in the generation after Christ. And he wrote a long history on this. And he says that Moses was, as far as they knew during their time, that Moses was a general in Pharaoh's army during the 40 years that he lived there. Maybe the latter 10 years or so, he would have been as a young child. But in those first 40 years, he was a general in Pharaoh's army and was coming back from a major defeat of the Libyan army. It was almost like David and Saul, so to speak. That here comes Moses fresh off this victory, and the Pharaoh that is there probably has some jealousy because they would have grown up at the same time, right? So that in Pharaoh's house were probably all kinds of kids. So you've got the direct heir that ended up becoming the next Pharaoh, and then probably all kinds of other children. And then you've got, because Pharaoh would have several wives, large families, and so within Pharaoh's home would be all kinds of children, but they would often raise them together. The children would be schooled together. Pharaoh's children would be separate from other places, and so maybe Pharaoh and some of his more elite people, their children would all be schooled together. So there's a good chance that the Pharaoh that took over right around the time that Moses fled would have been someone his own age that grew up with him together, and there was perhaps some animosity there. Who knows? Clearly, they couldn't have been too close. Otherwise, when he found out that Moses had killed somebody, he wouldn't have wanted to kill Moses. So it seems like he was perhaps already not too happy with Moses, or maybe saw him in a weird light. So Moses coming back with all of this acclaim, because that was a huge victory that was won in Libya, which is just to the west of Egypt. And so Moses coming back fresh off of that, then kills an Egyptian and has to flee. And so Moses would have known the world, I guess was my point in saying all of that, that Moses wasn't just, it wasn't an unknown world to him at the time. He would have chosen where he wanted to go, right? Another interesting thought along those lines, as far as him being a general, is that when God got ready to ask him to go speak to Pharaoh, he gets very anxious, kind of self-conscious when it comes to speaking publicly. But then just a couple of years later, God asked him to lead the army to fight against Moab and Ammon. The Amalekites came and attacked Egypt, and Moses went and defeated them. That's the battle where Moses was on the mountain and Joshua was in the valley. I think it's interesting that we don't see anywhere when God tells Moses to go to war that Moses has any anxiety, right? You would think if anywhere Moses was going to be scared, it would have been leading somebody into a battle, not going to speak publicly in front of Pharaoh. But if, as Josephus tells us, if all that is correct, that Moses was a general in Pharaoh's army before he fled, then he would have had all kinds of experience leading people into battle, and that wouldn't have been an area of fear for him, right? So that's kind of interesting. Because never anywhere, any of the times Moses was victorious in every battle that they fought, except for the one time they tried to go in after God told them, you're not going to go in. And Moses even told him, he said, you're not going to have victory because God said that he's not going to let you go in, right? And so some of the guys went in anyways and lost. And then they started the 40 years of wandering. But Moses was very adept at battle. He took that whole eastern side of the promised land. So even though he didn't cross the Jordan, what was traditionally during biblical times, the promised land was not just on that side of the Jordan, or what became the land of Israel was also that whole eastern side that Moses took. So in some ways, Moses did get to walk in the land that became Israel because the whole eastern side was Reuben and Manasseh and Gad, and that amount of area was almost the same size as the area that they took on the west. And so what Moses took on the east before they crossed the Jordan in Joshua's day was very similar in size to the actual classical promised land that they took when they crossed over. And so all of that had to be taken, and Moses took all of that against a general by the name of Og, a king by the name of Og, and Moses defeated him and took most of that realm there. So anyways, why Midian, right?
Midian was out of Egypt and it was remote, and he could probably felt like he could probably hide there, not be observed by any of the Egyptians because it's away from most of the trade routes, I think.
Okay, so we have Midian is down off this way. Egypt is over here. Sinai Peninsula is through this way. You've got the Red Sea. Midian comes up this way. So in some respects, it's away from trade routes. It's definitely more remote. In between, this Sinai Peninsula, even today, is not cultivated much. It was a mining district. Interestingly, the Egyptians tended to view gods in the Egyptian kind of world as being regional, right? So depending on what part of Egypt you were in, there might have been a particular Egyptian god that they revered more or less based on a specific area. So that was kind of how many people thought in those days. So the Philistines may have a god that they served, and the Amalekites may have a god that they served, and they thought as long as they were in their land, that was the god of that area, right? So you get to the god of the Hebrews, he was God in that kind of realm. And so many people that were polytheistic, that worshiped many gods, just thought that there were several gods and the different ones had their own geography that they kind of ruled over, almost how the kings would, right? A king would have a certain area of land, and so they, in their polytheistic ways, would think, okay, there are several gods, and this particular god has chosen these people, and he's protecting them in that geography, right? So a war on the battlefield was not just a war between people. They also considered it as a war between their gods, right? Whichever god was stronger would be the one that would be victorious. And so that's kind of how they viewed it. It's just interesting that in the Sinai region where they passed through on the way to Midian, on the way to the Mount Sinai over here in Arabia, this whole Sinai Peninsula and all of this desert area was what they considered to be the realm of Horus, which was often symbolized by a calf, bull, right, ibex. And so begs the question, if when the Israelites got here, if that's why they chose, of all of the Egyptian gods that they could have chose, why they chose the ibex, the bull, is probably most likely because of that same region, that this was the region assigned to Horus as where his government was. And so when they got to that area and they wanted to worship the god of that area, they built the golden calf, right, that is so famous now. And so Moses then comes off and you know the story. But so anyways, that's probably kind of the backstory behind that. So there is something to the fact that this is a remote area. There's not much water in these regions. So he could have hidden here. So that's one element. Any other thoughts about why Midian, right? Because, I mean, there were probably more lush areas to go to, right? Obviously, you know.
Well, the Midians were also descendants of Abraham, and he thought they may have felt more comfortable with that.
Right. So that's the one that I'm going after. That Midian was a son of Abraham, right? And so Moses, knowing this, any of the other Canaanite regions, right, in northern areas up here in Israel and things like that, would have been Canaanite. Everyone traces back to Noah, but that was probably too far. They were enemies by the time we get to Moses' day. And so Midian was one of Abraham's sons through Keturah, right, his third wife. Second wife. Depends on how you view Hagar. She's more of a handmaiden, I guess.
Was this Midian the same one that Gideon?
Yes. So this area over here kind of exploded in different times. It became kind of a catch-all term for all of these Arab groups that kind of swept in during the time of Gideon. And it would have been more than just this area here. It would have been that whole Saudi Arabian group probably to get that many of them that Gideon faced. And so it's just kind of an interesting thought that he's probably looking for someone that is a relative. Is probably why he chose this place, because these Midianites were, the Israelites were sons of Abraham. And Midian is the only nation really at this time that has emerged that would probably have been peaceful to him. You've got the Edomites up there, you get the Moabites and the Ammonites were Lot's children, and then you've got the Edomites who were Esau's descendants, and then down here you've got Midian who were traced all the way back to Abraham. And so most likely what we're seeing here is him trying to find somebody that would welcome him in without seeing him as a rival, that he would have been a distant relative. Right? Okay. And then let me give you one other interesting one since we're talking about Egypt here. And this one you probably won't find anywhere else because I was reading a book and it just kind of hit me when I was reading it. Maybe the Lord dropped it in my spirit. So this one, you probably won't have heard this one anywhere. But it is kind of interesting that the Egyptians, and trust me, I'm going somewhere. It's not, don't want to just teach you Egyptian, idolatry here or anything. But the way that their god system worked was they had a god of the underworld, right? And so this god of the underworld had a brother, and these two were twins. And their father's name, the head god of the whole thing, you've probably heard of Ra, perhaps, right? The sun god from any of the movies, right? There's a reason why I'm telling you all this. That Ra would have been the sun god, the one that you hear the most in the movies. His other name is Atum, right? Same thing, right? It means this is the same person, just two different ways of saying it. So when the Israelites were building the storehouses, right? They had two cities that the Israelites were working on. So they were building bricks for the Egyptians while they were slaves, and they were building two cities. They were building Ramses and Pithom, right? So Pithom is just house of Atum, so Pithom, and then Rameses is the house of Ra, basically, right? So they were two very similar sounding things that they were working on. So this does, a lot of times people point to the later Pharaoh Ramses, because there was a Pharaoh by the name of Ramses, which was way later, just happens to be about 300 years later. We told you a couple weeks ago that the Egyptian dating is off, and so because they're off by about 300 years, a lot of things don't line up, but there just happens to be a guy about 300 years whose name is Ramses, and so a lot of people say, oh, well, they were building a city called Ramses, it had to have been during his day, and then it further leads to the confusion of why things don't line up properly. But this just means house of Ra, so it's not really even meaning anything particularly that one particular pharaoh. They had a lot of Ramses all the way through because that was their main god that they worshipped, right? So that doesn't necessarily mean that had anything to do with that pharaoh. That pharaoh was named after this because that was such a common thing in their religion, right? The pharaoh that promoted Joseph was one of the ones that helped bring this into prominence. So that 12th dynasty that Joseph was part of, that the Israelites were slaves under, this was their main form of religion with these two guys. And then later they began to deviate in later years and bring in all kinds of these other gods. Possibly why we had the 10 plagues. You could make a case that each of those plagues was a direct attack on one of the Egyptian gods, as if to say there is no God but the Lord. And so it's a lot easier to teach with some nice mood music. It's nice. And so you've got these two cities. So anyways, the reason that this is kind of interesting is they call one of these twins Seth. And then the other one is Iris. And at first it didn't hit me until I read the story that this was the God, their first God. And he had twin sons, but one of them was evil and killed the other son. And this one that he killed became the god of the underworld because he was the first one to go down there. Does it sound like anybody that might have been in Genesis chapter 1? Dun, dun, dun. You're okay.
Are you saying without the pie in front of it?
Yeah, so pi just means house. The guy's name is Adam.
Could it be Adam?
Adam.
Yeah.
Who had two sons. They've got, their story's a little twisted. Seth was one of them. He wasn't the evil one. The name is a little twisted. But they've got this one here, and he was killed by his twin brother. So Adam, which is from Python, Adam, this is the Egyptian god all the way through. He was the first one, right? This is their god, and he had these two sons. One of the sons killed the other one. And so the god of their underworld was the killed twin because he was the first person to die. And so it's very similar to the biblical story of Adam and his sons, meaning Abel, the first person to die. The Egyptians maybe don't even realize this, but it seems like what has happened is this creation story has come down to them, just like Noah would have passed down the story to all of the groups. Every group has a creation story. Every group has a flood story. So anyway, I think it's kind of interesting that it seems like the creation story got changed a little bit, and they began to worship these initial characters instead of worshiping the Lord. And so there is an Adam who was the first. His twin sons, one of his sons was evil. It's funny they call him Seth because Cain was lost, and they were lost, and Seth was the next one. So Seth was the only one whose name actually survived down because Cain was in exile and Abel was dead. So Seth becomes the only one. So even today they talk about Seth over there in Egypt. But so it's just kind of interesting that it just hit me one day. I said, Adam. I said, wait a minute. Adam with his two sons, and one of them was killed. This is their creation story of how the original gods were. And so they've taken this creation story from Genesis and turned it into some kind of idolatrous thing that Adam was the first. He had two sons. One of his sons was killed by the other one because he was jealous. And this one was the first person to go to the underworld. And so this becomes the god of the underworld for the Egyptians. And it makes sense because Abel was the first one to die. And so they considered him. Yeah. So it's their whole God structure is not all that different from our creation structure, except they worship it. Instead of worshiping God who created these people, they are worshiping some of these original characters. It'd be hard to prove that, but when you put the story in there, that this is their founding gods, their first people that they say existed, it's kind of interesting how closely that fits with the creation story. That all this time they were worshiping things that was really just the creation story that had been handed down to them. All right. All right, so let's get back. We talked on some of the reasons why we don't have many archaeological discoveries, right? And so we talked about how it's not that there are just none from Israel, there are none from that entire time period. So we know that, I mean, we've unearthed cities from those time periods from both Israel and Moab, right? Just so everybody remembers where we're at here. Clearly in the promised land. And so over here you've got all these other nations, right? That we've got cities from them. I mean, we know that they had civilizations there. We just maybe don't have any archaeological discoveries with a lot of names for whatever reason. So, you know, we don't have the name of Solomon very much. We don't have the name of David too often, only about 5 times. And so the criticism becomes, how come, if they were such a dominant nation, why is there not more from them, right? But the truth is, there's not anything from any of these nations with names either, right? And we know that there's people here during this time. If you've ever seen Indiana Jones, you've seen the Edomite capital, right? You may remember the third Indiana Jones. You may watch that. The Cup of Christ. Okay, and you know they go into that building there, and it's carved into the rocks. It's called Petra. The city is called Petra, and it's carved into these rocks. And Indiana Jones goes in there, and that's where he's looking for the Cup of Christ. Well, Petra is the Edomite capital. It's Esau's sons. They carved that, and so that's an actual place where that Indiana Jones takes place, and that was the capital that Esau's sons built. And so we know that there's people there. We just don't have any of their names either. Things are just so old, and the Semitic style wasn't as much to carve their names into things as much as the Egyptians or the Assyrians did. So they were a different style of architecture, often much more rural than some of the larger nations. Even though Solomon was blessed with all kinds of wealth. Sometimes it sounds so much, we talked about this in some other classes, but sometimes it sounds so much to think of 600 tons of gold that Solomon reportedly had. Because, I mean, you know, that would fill up, you know, a couple hundred, you know, rooms with just his treasure alone almost, you know, when we're talking about solid gold. I mean, it would be whole rooms like this filled with gold. Until you realize that the other nations kept records of their gold, and they had way more than that. When Alexander the Great conquered Persia, it was like almost 5,000 tons of gold that Persia had, that Alexander the Great took from Persia. And so even though from a biblical perspective, Solomon was the most blessed king of the Israelites, in terms of the Egyptians or the Assyrians or some of these other nations, they still were not quite at their levels. And so, and that's probably part of why you don't see as much inscription. I think that the more important part, though, is the cultural aspect. That I think perhaps because the Israelites worshiped the Lord so much that they weren't trying to exalt themselves as much as some of these Egyptian pharaohs were, particularly David, because we don't find too much from him. Just about everything that we found from David, with the exception of one thing, were other nations that wrote about him. Right. So that's all the mentions of the name of David, with the exception of one kind of plaque that was found that had the mention of David's name on it. Everything else that talks about David from that time period comes from a surrounding nation that talked about, we have an Egyptian record from 50 years after the time of David, so it would have been during the time of Solomon. An Egyptian pharaoh called that area of the Negev, which is that desert where David was hiding from Saul. That pharaoh calls that the hills of David. And so he wrote, we have that in one of the pharaoh's hieroglyphic reports on a wall. He talks about sending an army to the hills of David, and so that would have been within 40 years of David's life, that they were already being called the hills of David. So that's a very early one. We have reference to the house of David from enemies, instead of referring to a particular king of Judah or a particular king of Israel. If they were talking about Judah, they would call it the house of David. Anybody know what they called Israel? Because, you know, the top 10 tribes, they wouldn't have taken the name of David. So from then on out, they tended to call them after this. Their most important king was a guy by the name of Omri. Omri was one of the kings of the 10 tribes. And so when we have, the Bible talks about, he had a really long reign, and it talks about he was blessed financially, not so much a godly guy during Israel's time, but apparently this was kind of the golden age of the 10 tribes, because all the other surrounding nations, even after his death, refer to the 10 tribes as the house of Omri whenever they write about their stuff. And the southern tribes, they call those the house of David. Right? So Omri was apparently one of the builder kings of Israel. So they were very wealthy during his time, and that became what that region was known as. All right, so we're going to talk about some sort of things. So we talked about how we don't have much from anyone in that culture, right? Let me see, I had a few others. We talked about how they've built buildings on top of these sites. It's very difficult now to go back in there and unearth something. And even if there was something in there, a lot of it's going to be crushed under the weight of that stuff. They're trying to do better with that now. I know recently they have required that if you build something in Israel, that the government gets to send a archaeological team as part of the permit process for the construction, an archaeological team to explore the site first, because they can veto your construction if they think there's something important there. And so now they're trying to save some of these sites. But Jerusalem itself, the actual city where so much of this has happened, it's already built up. And then another one, I don't know if we talked about this, but war has ravaged this land quite a bit. You know, the Crusades, some modern wars, you know, so you've got a lot of battles that have taken place here. You know, the Crusades, this was the focal point of all of the Crusades, was trying to liberate Jerusalem. And so there was a lot of fighting there, a lot of destruction. We talked about churches being built on these places. They thought, oh, this is an important place, let's build a church. Not thinking that future generations might want to see the important place too, and they're not going to because we built a church on it. And so most of the important places in the Bible have a church built on them. If you go inside, they tried to keep like the main spot clear, you know, so you can kind of still get an idea of what that one spot looked like, but the spot itself is covered with some kind of a church most of the time. Another reason, we talked about less than 2% of all sites have been really fully excavated, right? So the majority of the nation of Israel is not an archaeological project. You know, I mean, they've got 10 or 12 of these things that maybe each one might be an acre in size or something. So, I mean, you're talking about 12 acres being excavated right now out of an entire country, you know. So, so most of the land of Israel is not being excavated, you know. So kind of puts it into perspective, you know, because the nation of Israel is not quite as big as Florida, but right around that part, maybe the bottom part without the panhandle. 120 miles by 60 miles is the basic look of the country. And so it's still a big place for only about 12 acres to be actively having permits for excavation or so, you know. So that's a big part of it. Is, you know, it's expensive. American archaeology, I think, has done a lot of good things and a lot of bad things in the way that they do it. They are so detailed and so thorough that they don't miss anything, but they're so detailed and so thorough that they don't get to much either. You know, so they really take their time going through, because I think a big part of it is they're fearful of the criticism of fellow archaeologists when they look at their work. If they weren't real thorough, then, you know, then people, you know, give you a hard time in those kind of circles. You know, so it's almost like a bragging right to be really thorough, but then for just the average person who's interested in these findings, it really slows things down. So I think there's a little bit of a fear of publishing your work in front of millions of other archaeologists and what people will say if you weren't really thorough, you know. And so that level of thoroughness slows us way down. When you read your Dead Sea Scrolls book, that's an example of that, about how it took them, you know, 40, 50 years to publish the Dead Sea Scrolls, you know, just because, you know, people wanted, you know, the first 8 guys wanted to be the 8 guys, and they didn't let anybody else in for almost 50 years.